Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Dialectic Report. The second episode really deals with the role of the US dollar as the world reserve currency. Now, great commentators like Max Kaiser, Greg Hunter and Gerald Celente talk extensively about the fundamental role of the US dollar as the world reserve currency. However, there isn't an extensive literature or videos about how that historically came about, or essentially what it is. So the aim of this video is to firstly define what a world reserve currency is, and secondly to give you a historical overview of the processes that has enabled the dollar to assume the fundamental role of the world reserve currency. A world reserve currency is a currency in which other foreign nations will save their surpluses as. Now, when a country such as Malaysia, Argentina or Sweden exports more goods and services to the rest of the world than it imports back, that nation will be left with what's known as a surplus. Now, that nation could keep its surplus in its own currency. However, if that currency is subject to volatility, so if it rises in value one day and falls dramatically in value the next day, that nation may be tempted to keep it in a currency that is perceived to have long-term stability. It's a bit like savings. So if you have your savings, you would want to keep it in a currency that will have long-term stability. So when you, in 20 years down the line, when you go back to retrieve your savings, they still hold pretty much the same value. Now, this is where the dollar comes in. From the periods of the 1980s onwards, the Federal Reserve committed itself to the strong dollar. So it essentially signaled to the rest of the world that the dollar will maintain long-term value. So other nations around the world thought that it would be best for them to maintain their surpluses, not in their own currencies, but in the currency of the US dollar. Before we go into any further detail, what that means is that these nations held an interest in maintaining the value of the dollar itself. So it's no longer the American economy or the Federal Reserve or Washington that had an interest in maintaining the dollar value, but the rest of the world, since the rest of the world too had its savings in the US dollar. Now, the story of the dollar's structural power really begins in the Second World War, or the aftermath of the Second World War period. At that time, Europe was experiencing incredible levels of misery, of destitution, impoverishment, and unemployment as a result of the war effort. So there's kind of a lot of discontentment within the kind of European populace, whilst on the other side of the pond, America kind of emerged out of the conflict as the most powerful nation in the history of the world. It really kind of assumed the role of the global leader in political and economic affairs. Now, because of the level of impoverishment and destitution, two immediate problems arose for the American leadership. The first one was a purely economic one. There was a lack of effective demand. A poor Europe couldn't afford the manufacturing goods that America made, which was very good at making at the time. The second reason was political. The sheer level of human misery at the time in Europe kind of gave rise to the communist threat. Palmiro Togliatti of Italy, the communist leader at the time, kind of won a lot of ground, and similar in France. There was a real sense of kind of a reawakening in the European people. They were kind of tired of an economic system of organization which kind of produced two world wars, a Great Depression, and the Holocaust. So there was a real kind of yearning for an alternative, which kind of the communists came in to fill. So what the American leadership contrived was the Marshall Plan, named of course after the General George Cartlet Marshall. And what it really comprised of was a series of loans made at reasonable interest rates to Europe on the condition of market liberalization. Now, the condition of market liberalization, which I'll cover in further videos, is quite an interesting one. It had a dual purpose. The first purpose was to kickstart the European economy, to bring down the walls of regulation and bring down the walls of taxes and customs and tariffs, and to really kind of begin the European integration. Essentially what America was trying to do was to impose its own kind of United States of Europe, and kind of mold Europe in its own image. So that was the first initial kind of purpose for the Marshall Plan, to kickstart the European economy. And the second one was to really kind of re-embed the capitalistic tenet of exchange relations in Europe. It's kind of, again, to begin to distance Europe away from the communist lure that kind of really embedded itself and impressed itself onto the European thought at the time. And all too well, the Marshall Plan worked very well. By the mid-50s, the European economies really kind of began the process of kind of re-industrializing and kind of capitalizing everything. And so the European machine began to kind of work again. The result of that, however, was a huge pool of dollars circulating within the European central and commercial banks. These were non-resident dollars, these were foreign dollars, which were outside of the US money supply and the US economy. So that's the real emergence of the US dollar becoming kind of more than a US, currency. So we see the emergence of the dollar becoming kind of really prominent in Europe, and from then on it kind of became a global theme. Again, I'll give a reference to the book that I've referred to quite a lot here, which is The Most Noble Adventure, The Marshall Plan. I'll leave the link below, but it's a book that kind of really talks about the first attitudes of America that tries to essentially take on a more of an active role in global affairs. Now, around about the time that the euro market for dollars was being established in Europe, simultaneously what was happening in America was that the Federal Reserve began to raise the rates of interest. It kind of began to abandon its low interest rates, which were there to really help fund the Treasury's war borrowing for the Second World War. So the interest rates were increased as initiated by the Federal Reserve. However, something unexpected occurred. When the interest rates began, American banks assumed that the large American corporations would deposit their extra revenues and their money deposits into the American banks. However, that didn't happen. What began to happen was that the large American corporations began, rather than investing it in American banks, began to invest them in short-term securities in the euro market of dollar in Europe. Now, it must be noted here that the European financial market was rather highly deregulated relative to the highly regulated New Deal regulation framework that was placed after the Great Depression. So Europe could produce these exotic financial instruments like securities, which I'll explain shortly, to produce these high yields or high interest rate securities that could essentially yield 8 or 9%, that could outcompete the perhaps 3-4% yield that the American banks could give. So that was essentially where the American corporations' money went. Now, the American banks felt a double squeeze. So the fact that the large American corporations ceased to deposit their extra revenue in American banks meant that the American banks had less revenue to lend out. So it's really in a kind of a between a rock and a hard place. Its very existence was being kind of put into question. If it doesn't have deposits placed in its banks, then essentially it can't lend them out in the domestic economy. So essentially, the American banking sector had to either innovate or die. The innovation it came up with was a certificate of deposit, which is essentially a security. Now, the best way to understand a security, it's a kind of one of those jargons that's placed out there in the mainstream media. The best way to understand it is it's a stock, but it's not a stock in the performance of a company. Say, if I'm going to buy a share of stock in Apple, and if the company performs, then I'll get a dividend or a kind of an interest rate yield. But a security is a stock in the performance of a debt. So we had the mortgage-backed security. So I would buy an MBS, a mortgage-backed security, on the hope that that the lender receives the payments of the borrower. So I am kind of investing in the performance of the debt. Now, the kind of in that kind of period, kind of the mid to early 50s, the certificate of deposit was really a security based on performance of the borrower, which was the bank, to fulfill its obligations to the lender, which was the depositor. So that could have been you or me. So that was a kind of an innovation that occurred for the American banks to survive. It was a short-term loan and the interest rates were a lot higher and more competitive. That could compete with a kind of deregulated euro market. So that's essentially how the American banks fought back and trying to compete with a less regulated euro market for dollars. Now, one crucial event which solidified and cemented the role of the euro market was the credit crunch of 1966 in America. What happened was that the American economy at that time was going through a huge boom. It had almost full employment, 4% unemployment at the time, which was incredibly low, and its productive capacity was working almost at full steam. So everything that could produce in the economy, from factories to laboratories to labor productivity, was being utilized. So what the business community at the time anticipated was a continued boom. So they did their calculations and they predicted that the boom would continue until the 6-7 years ahead. So they thought, well, to meet that demand, we should try and borrow money today and essentially work up capital to meet the demand tomorrow. So the private sector was out there to acquire funds from the banks. Now, similarly at that time, in 1966, the American government was engaging in the Vietnam War. So the government too was after funds. Now it was after funds from the financial markets, namely because it could indulge in some creative accounting. So it could make the numbers seem far less worse than they were, and they could kind of do tricks in accounting to kind of essentially ease the deficit woes, as it were. So you had a double squeeze. You had the private sector after funds from the banks, and you had the public sector, the actual government after funds. However, the problem was that the banks were under what was known as the regulation Q, which meant that they were unable to raise their interest rates above a certain level, which was still a remnant of the old New Deal policy framework. So, since the interest rates went high enough for everyday Americans to deposit their savings into the banks, there wasn't enough money capital in the banks to meet the demand of the government that's about to go into the Vietnam War, and the private sector that wants the funds to meet future anticipated demand. And therefore, at that time, you had the credit crunch of 1966. Now, what came to the rescue was the euro market. There was this huge floating pool of dollars that were kind of foreign to the US money supply that they could essentially make use of, and which they both did. So that was essentially the credit crunch of 1966 was really a time when it became established in kind of in global finance as a source of funds wherever and whenever needed. And it was from then on that the American banks themselves began to borrow from the euro market funds as a way to bypass old New Deal regulations. So the credit crunch of 1966 is a kind of a seminal moment when the euro market became instituted as the place to go for short-term or long-term funds as they were needed. Now, crucially, as the American banking sector began to also borrow funds from the euro market, what essentially was happening was that the money supply in America was being constantly expanded. What I mean by that was the stock of money in America was continually being added to by the extra stock of dollars in the euro market. And what was beginning to happen by the late 60s was an increase in inflation. So the inflation was steadily increasing, and economists at the time realized that if they don't halt the repatriation of these foreign non-resident dollars, that inflation was going to get slowly out of hand, because although the money supply was increasing, the relative amount of goods and services in America was relatively stable. So you can expect inflation if you have more dollars chasing the same number of goods and services. And it was actually recorded there was a steady increase in inflation around about towards the end of the 60s. Now, a crucial development that cannot be stressed enough is 1971. when Richard Nixon defaulted on all its debts and went off the gold standard. Now, what does that mean and what are the implications? When America lost the Vietnam War, Washington realized that it could never really repay all of its debts when those debts were backed by gold, because all currency before 1971 was backed by a certain quantity of gold. So the American leadership realized that if we are going to repay everything we own, we can only give it nominally. So in other words, we can only give paper currencies to countries or to whoever we owe money to, but we cannot back that in gold, namely because it would go bankrupt. So Richard Nixon had no real alternative but to go off the gold standard. So in 1971, all currencies were not backed by any real commodity; they were merely backed by political force. So if the sovereign state said this is money, the citizens had to essentially accept that, and that's what happened. However, they realized that if it's not backed by money, then all these extra dollars that are floating around, there must be a mechanism to stop that from going back to the American economy. And so what happened very soon after is, again, still in the early 70s, was the formation of the petrodollar. That's another crucial part of the puzzle, which I will cover in future videos. But the petrodollar really is a mechanism where petrol can only be sold in the US dollar. Now that was an invention of Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, and it was done for multitudinous amount of reasons, but one of them was to keep these non-resident dollars away from the US economy to stop inflation. So you had the emergence of the petrodollar, which was a commitment by OPEC, so all the oil producing economies of the world, to sell dollars strictly, to sell oil strictly in dollars. Now, what began to happen, irregardless of the formation of the petrodollar, was the increase in inflation. Now, in the late 70s, I believe from 78, 79, the amount of inflation eroded something like 50% of the overall value of the dollar. So what was still happening was that the American banking sector was just still borrowing funds and drawing funds from the foreign euro market and channeling that into the domestic market. So there were more and more dollars that were entering into the domestic US economy and were being lent out by these American banks. So the Federal Reserve had no other real alternative but to raise interest rates. And that's what happened with the Paul Volcker shock. Around about 1979, 1980, what Paul Volcker did was he rapidly raised and significantly raised the rates of interest. Now what that did was it discouraged domestic savers from putting their savings in other markets such as the euro market and putting them in American banks, namely because they could get something like 9% interest rates. So the interest rates were raised really high. So what that did, it placed a lot of money reserves, money capital, back into the American banks. So the banks again didn't need to resort to the euro market, and they could lend out from the domestic savers, so the deposits of the domestic savers. So it gave more control to the Federal Reserve in regards to the money supply. It didn't give full control, but it halted the increase in the money supply. And so essentially from the early 80s onwards, the Federal Reserve made a commitment to fight inflation. Now I'll reference the article I'm using, but I'm using Martijn Konings' article on America's structural power. It's a great scholarly article that he gives, and it chronicles slowly the rise of the American dollar. And I'll leave the link below, and which is what I'm basing my argument here on. I've done kind of extra research on it, but I think he captures the overall structural argument of how American power backed by the dollar kind of emerged. But that was a crucial episode in global affairs when, starting from the early 80s, America made a commitment to fight inflation, which kind of gave a signal to the rest of the world that if you want a safe currency to put all your savings in, which is the reserves of a nation. So a person's savings are called savings. A nation's savings, its surplus is called reserves. So the Fed signaled to the world that if you want a safe currency that won't lose value, the dollar is the best currency to do that. So kind of from that period onward, called the King Dollar period, a lot of nations essentially saved their reserves as dollars. So what essentially they did was with their currency, they bought a lot of American bonds or treasury bonds. So they gave the American Treasury their own money, and the American Treasury made a promise to them that in 10 or 20 years time, whenever, we'll give you all the money that you've given us plus a certain yield or a certain rate of interest. So that was a period when the world began to acquire dollar debt. So a bond is essentially that. A treasury bond is debt. America's debt to the rest of the world. And since it signaled the safe dollar, since it signaled to the investors, whether public or private investors, that yes, we will maintain the value of the dollar. And that period was when a lot of the world bought a lot of American treasuries on the promise that their reserves will maintain their value. And so that was when essentially America's structural power really increased. When nations such as Malaysia, Sweden, Argentina, and various other nations began to invest their future in the American dollar. So that was the emergence of the American dollar as the world reserve currency. Now the fundamental question you may have is, what's significance of the dollar as the world reserve currency, or the petrodollar? Now all the geopolitical hotspots we've been seeing, all the kind of the global wars and the games that we've seen all around the world is namely due to these two phenomena. The first phenomena, which is the petrodollar, that I'll cover in my next video, so essentially deals with the fact that there are numerous deals between Saudi Arabia and China, and between Russia and China, these two huge oil deals that bypass the dollar mechanism and bypass the dollar currency. So what we're having an unraveling of the petrodollar created under Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. And the second ramification of the crash is quantitative easing, which essentially is the devaluing of the dollar. So all these countries from kind of the 80s onwards began to buy dollar debt on the premise that the Federal Reserve would maintain the value of the dollar. However, that promise has been betrayed and has been broken, since by printing more and more and more US dollars, they're trying to devalue the value of the US dollar. So they're trying to inflate the debt that they own to the world. Now, the next episode I'll do will cover the petrodollar and the crisis in the Middle East, and the one after that I'll cover in some kind of a general detail about the quantitative easing that we've had since 2008 and the ramification that has on the housing sector and other sectors. Thank you very much for watching, and I've been Omar. Thank you.